This is all. What was your question? Oh, no. So we're more of a state. The silence means anticipation. Is that? FIU is rocketed into one of the top 50 public universities in the country. That probably deserves an applause also. That's an amazing feat. 50 years, one of the top 50 universities in the country. And Wall Street Journal last week named FIU #1 in terms of social mobility. And so this institution has been an incredible powerhouse, not just in South Florida, but in the country. And so we're really, really proud of that. And we know that this is certainly just the beginning. I want to congratulate the FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and of course the Gordon Institute team for putting this program together. The Green School, where's Pedro? Pedro's here, the Green School, and our dean continue to strive to be a convening space for critical conversations among key players addressing pivotal issues of our time. And so we're grateful for the partnership and grateful for the leadership that the Green School has in moving these conversations forward. I especially want to give a shout out to the Gordon Institute Intelligence Fellows. If you're looking at all these young, dapper, sharply dressed people in the front row here, these are all aspiring intelligence professionals. These are FIU students that said they wanted to step into the space to safeguard U.S. national security. And so we're really proud that you were all here. And of course, the Institute and the Green School offer students opportunities to engage in meaningful public policy discourse, analyzing critical issues facing national security. Today, we're grateful to partner with I use the very intentionally, the prestigious Brookings institution. The event is part of their Global China Project, which rigorously examines the choices and trade-offs for the United States and its partners in managing long-term competition with China. I encourage you to check out Brookings' Global China webpage that features past debates and essays on issues ranging from U.S. policy in Taiwan to the U.S.-China economic relationship. We're grateful that Brookings, we're grateful that you chose FIU as your partner, and we're excited about the enduring relationship that we continue to have with such key think tanks like yours. And so we're privileged to partner with you. Today, we're going to hear about two rivaling powers, the U.S. and China. I framed it as rivaling powers, hopefully to be a little bit provocative, but certainly that feels like the sentiment of the relation dynamic between China and the United States globally today. The discussion complements a written product where the panelists on stage held a series of exchanges around the question of U.S.-China actions in Latin America and how to characterize them. Is it a rivalry? Is it cooperation? Or is it something in between? I recall in 2008, and by the way, it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I recall in 2008, John Eikenberry published a piece in the Foreign Affairs titled "The Rise of China and the Future of the West. Can the liberal system survive?" Eikenberry at the time argued that liberal international order led by the United States and Western allies is resilient and can endure despite the rise of China. He went on to argue that rather than confront China, the United States and the West should guide China into a Western-inspired world order. That notion continues to be passionately debated today, with, of course, some advocating to confront China, while others argue that we need to find deeper, more meaningful threads of collaboration. And I think that sets the stage for the discussion we're going to have today. So as we further discussions here, let's first consider the strategic stakes. Latin America has emerged as a critical region for both the United States and China, where political, economic, and security interests are at play. Second, we must consider the impact that the China-U.S. dynamic has on the region itself. China's growing economic presence through infrastructure investment, trade, and technology partnerships has certainly created space for China to assert its interests. But is this growing footprint translating into meaning and deeper Chinese political influence in the region? And how should the US adjust its own policies in response? And of course, what does this mean for the region? Finally, the question of rivalry, competition, or something in between. Are there opportunities for the US and China to collaborate in Latin America, perhaps on issues like climate change or development? Or are we moving to areas where we see more conflicting interests, issues around military cooperation, technology, or soft power? I look forward to hearing the perspectives from our thoughtful, distinguished panelists today. And we're also joined by Aranza Loizaga, a network news anchor with NBC Universal, Telemundo Enterprises, who's joining us today to moderate this discussion. This event is in part from the support of the Ford Foundation, which has helped fund the Global China Project. The event reflects only the views of the speakers themselves. It's in my notes, I have to say that. And a few additional items before I kick it over to Aranza. We are on the record for today's discussion. A question and answer session will follow after they conclude, sort of the speaking portion. So please send your questions via events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu, or on X, formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag #GlobalChina. And with that, Aranza, I turn it over to you.
So much. Well, thank you for having us here. I think we're up for a fantastic conversation with the panelists that we have here right now. And I don't know if you are ready to begin this conversation with your opening remarks. Leland, please.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, Aranza, Valerie, Evan, Ted, it's a pleasure and an honor to be in this event with you. And it's really an honor for FIU to host such an important event. And it's also great to see friends and colleagues, my boss over there, and of course the students. So it's really an honor. I put as the title of my piece, Latin America and the Caribbean and China, it's more than the economy, stupid. One, just to be provocative, but two, because really over the past several decades, whether it be China watchers from Latin America and the Caribbean or Latin American and Caribbean watchers from Washington, there's been a over-focus on just the trade and economic portion of the relationship. And it makes sense. Trade was, $18 billion 2 decades ago. Now it's ballooned to $450 billion today. Trade has, of course, increased far beyond raw materials and commodities as before. But we have seen, definitely in recent years, that economic security and national security are really two sides of the same coin, right? And we like to talk about dual use now in a lot of Washington circles, but really the Chinese have been talking about dual use for well over a decade, right? The Junmin Ronghe, the military-civil fusion program, right? And so what does that mean in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, I think there are several areas where this is playing out. One is, of course, ports. There are dozens of ports that have some form of Chinese construction or ownership or involvement. And there's a very real concern on the part of national security experts that, let's say, in the form of a conflict between the US and China in the Pacific, to what extent could the PRC force some of the Chinese companies that are operating these ports to somehow restrict US naval or commercial access in the regions? That's one. Two is surveillance and espionage. Everybody talks about 5G, Huawei, ZTE. But there's also other companies like Nuke Tech that creates port scanning equipment. There's ZPMC, which creates various cranes in different ports. And there's been increased concern that malware can be put into those equipment, could be used again to potentially shut down or interfere with port operations. Space is another one. There are 11 or 12 space-enabling infrastructure projects in South America. And of course, therefore, ostensibly research projects, but there is a concern that the same satellites and same antennas that can be used to track and receive information from their own satellites can also be used to track or interfere with the satellites of some of our own or our partners. Law enforcement is another. Just a couple weeks ago, the PRC Ministry of Public Security actually announced that through the Global Security Initiative, that they want to train thousands of law enforcement officials throughout the whole world, including in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And finally, the rise of illegal Chinese networks, both in Latin America and the Caribbean and globally. Now, of course, there's dispute about whether there's any connections between the CCP and these illegal groups, but there is no doubt that the Chinese money launderers have become the key money launderers for the Sinaloa cartel, for Jalisco. There are cells sort of throughout the United States engaged in everything from marijuana grows in rural Maine and in Oklahoma, right? And even Northern California. We're actually working on a paper about this. But then also in Latin America and the Caribbean, human smuggling, wildlife trafficking, and other crimes like that. So it really has become, again, it started off with economics, but it has ballooned into so many security issues that directly and indirectly affect U.S. national security.
Thank you, Leland.
I agree actually with Leland that a lot of what the especially current conversation is really around this tech frontier, and hopefully we can get into that a bit more. My piece was called A New Cold War is Bound to Backfire in Latin America, and I think we can probably get into that as well a little bit. So I will frame this opening statement with kind of my view on what the question is. Is it rivalry? Is it cooperation? Is it somewhere in between? I would say that China's footprint in Latin America represents a really complicated dynamic for the United States. On the one hand, a lot of these economic investments, they have created some jobs. They have created some infrastructure. It's been uneven in terms of quality, location, impact in various regions. But I also think that there are ways that China's role in the region has harmed some of the strategic interests, whether it's inadvertent or advertent, I'm sure we can debate. But simply because part of what China does doesn't have to think about necessarily some of these short-term issues, these more acute challenges that are tied to migration, that are tied to transnational crime, that are tied to narco trafficking, to guns coming back and forth across the border. Instead, they can pursue economic interests, strategic interests that align with their objectives in terms of growth. We've seen this in terms of aligning with leaders in the region that promote bad governance, that maybe fuel some of the migration that we see. And so I think that, again, debating whether that's advertent or inadvertent, it certainly creates and poses a challenge in terms of what the US is capable of doing. And so what we've seen in the US context is a focus on more of these acute challenges, stemming these flows, working on the security issues, rather than focusing, I think, on some of the longer term things that would fuel economic growth, that would fuel Western Hemisphere cooperation and prosperity.
Thank you, Valerie. Dr. Ellis.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to echo what my colleagues. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here today. I want to thank Brookings. I want to thank FIU for the opportunity. I know having worked, it seems like an almost daily or weekly basis with the program here at FIU and Leland, just what a voice that FIU is becoming in this space. But for me also, thinking back, I've been doing this since the early 2000s. And I remember one of the very first major policy events that we did was actually with Brookings, with TED, back in 2009, with then Deputy Secretary of Defense Frank Mora talking about this. And I think over the years, as we've already talked about, not only China's footprint in Latin America as elsewhere has evolved, the understanding among Latin Americans and among others has evolved. The U.S. policy response, obviously thinking about the 2017 NSS and how that's been carried forward in the Biden administration in important ways, has also evolved. But there's also a lot of continuity. And as I was looking at the debate, I think one of the important things that we have here today, obviously there are some important differences, but also I think it's okay to say that, yes, there are concerns Yes, not everything's a concern. And how do we find the truth among the two? So in my opening remarks, I wanted to start out by saying a few relatively positive things as perhaps the representative hawkish person on the panel. Number one, it is true that most of Chinese activities in the region are economic, about China's pursuit of its own economic self-interest. Yes, you have a lot of leadership of SOEs, not just the Chinese state. Yes, there are individual entrepreneurs. We can think of people like Jack Ma. Yes, there is a certain level of state interest trying to make a world safe for the rise of China, and indirectly trying to pursue a world that is open to China, suppressing criticism, both of what China does abroad and in Latin America, and that really facilitates China's entry and really undercuts Latin America's ability to effectively pursue its interest in that relationship. But number two, yes, there is an amount of truth in saying Latin America can benefit from engagement with China. You can say that a lot of times Latin America doesn't get the benefits that it expects because a lot of that benefit, at least on China's terms, come from selling commodities at the lowest possible value added point, trying to set up deals to get Chinese financed, China worked infrastructure projects that, if the Latin Americans do it right, and oftentimes don't, theoretically can give you some infrastructure benefits. It's attracting Chinese investment, once again, making sure that you do it right so that it isn't the Chinese at the end of the day that walk away with all of the value added and controlling in a monopolistic fashion the sector. But there is the possibility of benefit there. And also the truths that usually is the Latin American response. There's a certain amount of truth that there has not been a whole lot of substantial Western investment at the level of China's promises in recent years. And also, the United States has not always been the best exemplar of how a democracy can be harmonious and function effectively in the region. So recognizing those things, which are often Latin America's retort when the United States expresses its concern, but all of that being true does not, in my judgment, mean that Latin America does not have the obligation and that's to look out for its own self-interest. But when you say self-interest, I would emphasize is not going with the suitor that says the nicest or most respectful things or seems to have the most shiny promises, which is oftentimes the PRC. Nor does it mean that you say, well, we're not going to take sides in your great power competition. Saying that does not take Latin America away from the responsibility to actually evaluate to what degree can it actually manage the risks of Chinese investment in order to achieve the benefit. And so I'd just like to mention very, very briefly 4 areas where I believe that Latin America needs to think more about its own self-interest. Number one is that in many countries of the region, and we can go into detail later, the difficulties with the strength of the institutions in the region, the ability to do technical evaluations of contract options for public works projects, the degree to which one can look at the details and the fine print of the contracts to really understand what one is getting into, especially when they're not transparent. The level of being able to protect against the tendency to get side benefits for those who are signing the contracts. All of those things undercut the ability of Latin America to be able to actually achieve the benefits they hope for and control the risks. And there are many examples. Just to name a few, of course, Coca-Cola Sinclair, the dam project that went bad in Ecuador, and really most of the other 5 major dam projects that took place under the Rafael Correa administration. We could talk about the Nicaragua Canal. We could talk about most projects that occurred under Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, including the abandoned Tanaco and Napo train project, the attempt to finance an expansion of capability of the Corporación Venezolano de Guyana, the famous cherry and Huawei production plants that we're going to get done. Most of the countries, starting with Costa Rica and extending to El Salvador and Honduras and the Dominican Republic and others, hoping to get dramatic expansions in exports to China that simply haven't happened. It's actually been just the imports penetrating Chinese markets. Or we could talk about the bullet train that Juan Carlos Varela signed up for in Panama. We could talk about the Skeldon Sugar Factory. We could talk about Baishan Lin. We could talk about in Costa Rica the Recovery Refinery, Ruta 32. You get the idea. And I think we generally understand why these things go wrong. It is, to a certain degree, we understand the degree of coordination among Chinese suppliers and subcontractors and in coordination with the Chinese government, or the very tradition of not wanting to speak bad about the Chinese creates an inability to properly assess the risks or properly work together at a country level to assure those interests. The webs of people-to-people relationships that I believe Leland alluded to, that is everything from the China Country X Business Council to the people who've gone to the Confucius Institutes and owe their education to China, et cetera, et cetera. Issues of, and also issues of lawfare. We can remember the issues of Bahamar, the way in which somebody as sophisticated as Sarkis Miralin in the Bahamas lost a $4 billion project because of the fine print that the Chinese put in, or the way in which Mauricio Macri in Argentina could not undercut turn off the pork barrel to Santa Cruz hydroelectric projects because they were tied to a project that his father was in. And of course, the most recently, the project that we talked about in Chiang Kai, that back in 2019, somehow the Peruvian government overlooked the fact that they were granting the Chinese investor Costco the right to run this port as a private port project, something that completely contradicted existing and past Peruvian law. And actually, the Peruvians were obliged to change their own law rather than find themselves bad with the Chinese, as Dina Boluarte looked to go to the PRC. And so you have those things. Leland mentioned the issue of organized crime, which is another problem area. And so with the illicit has come the illicit. Things like trade and finance, money laundering, of course, the flying money case that Leland has done a great job in helping to expose. The issue of fentanyl and precursors, the issue of human smuggling, gold, IUU fishing, wildlife, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk a little bit about the adverse impact of a PRC engagement on democracy, although an indirect effect. Venezuela, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, Nicaragua, to a certain extreme, Bolivia and Honduras. And the problem is basically that, by contrast to the Western concept that has underpinned the world order since the Second World War, which is you create strong institutions and rule of law and a level playing field for all. The Chinese concept, really as elaborated through the Global Civilization Initiative, is that difficult to know what universal principles are. And so in effect, the PRC seeking to make sure that their companies were taken care of, and what you do to everyone else's companies and contracts and good governance, that's not our problem. That is subtly enabled authoritarian states and undermined democracy. And then finally, the issue of war. And Leland alluded to this, and I'll go a little bit farther than Leland alluded to. Obviously, no one wants war, but when one looks at some of the very aggressive ways in which China is behaving in the South China Sea, issues of Taiwan, issues of the Philippines, those who are responsible for defending our nations, the U.S. Department of Defense, Southcom, General Richardson, but also on our Chinese side, thinking about the PLA as they look towards these economic opportunities as they have to plan for a possible war with China. Can anyone reasonably think that the PLA, being at least marginally competent, would just allow the United States to project power without interruption from the Western Hemisphere, without doing everything possible to interrupt those flows? So it's not a question of the Latin America can stay on or out of the sidelines, but the fact that those things like those port projects, those operations create the basis in which the PRC can observe and possibly interrupt U.S. deployment flows, U.S. sustainment flows, do things like impact the Panama Canal, alternative transits through the Straits of Magellan, do things like have access to Western Hemisphere space through programs such as they have in Argentina, as well as Bolivia and Venezuela and others, and sensitive issues such as the Port of Neuquén. And I want to go on record and just finish this here. I am not saying that a government such as that of Dina Boluarte would knowingly allow the Chinese to use Chiang Kai against the United States, nor am I saying that the very professional and pro-U.S. Peruvian military would allow such a thing to happen. But in a situation of complexity and contested sovereignty, it's easy to imagine that with a port in which the Chinese have the full legal latitude to operate it, not a lot of visibility on the Peruvian side of what is going on, the dilemmas, the pressures that countries would find themselves in the context of war, these are things that need to be thought about today, not that they would deliberately do harm, but these are issues that are raised that those of us who are responsible for defending and preparing for the defense of our own countries have to be thinking about. And so these are some of the dilemmas, I think, that you get into in something that is otherwise still a largely economic driven engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Mr. Ted.
Well, thank you, Brookings, Mike Brookings colleagues, and FIU for being here. A lot has already been said, so let me try to focus on just a few items to underscore. I think if you've read our pieces or will read our pieces, you'll see a lot of agreement on the fundamentals and a lot of nuance in how we should address with the United States. So let me build on that. I think in terms of the rivalry, competition, cooperation, I fall much closer to the rivalry side of the spectrum. And I'd say that because I see two very different countries and systems of governance between the United States and China. And I think it's meaningful when they then assert their interests around the world as China rises with a much more ambitious agenda than we've seen in the past in terms of restructuring the international order to suit its own interests. That is setting up a much more direct clash between the Western model that Evan referred to and the Chinese model, which really emphasizes, of course, their own self-interest, but a much more conservative, traditional notion of sovereignty and why that matters. I'll say a little bit more about that. But I take the view that China's influence in Latin America and maybe in other parts of the world has tended more towards a malign influence than a positive influence. And I say that when you look at Latin America specifically, its actions have tended to reaffirm the cycle, the economic cycle that Latin America has been stuck in for so long of primary commodities, very little value added in the chain. There are debt traps also that we've seen as a result of that. In the Chinese model, there's very little transparency. So the opacity of their actions, their deals that are being cut. I mean, even folks on Wall Street say, we can't trust China's figures, its numbers, because we can't see what's actually there, like even GDP numbers. And then you break that down specifically into particular deals. We don't actually know what's in a lot of these contracts and what concessions Latin American governments or businesses have made to the Chinese. We do know that in many cases, Latin Americans are operating from a position of weakness rather than strength. And China is the bigger player and has the deeper pockets. And then we've also touched on concerns about surveillance, the PR campaign that the Chinese have pushed very hard to suit their interests, and very close ties between even so-called private actors in China and with the Chinese Communist Party and intelligence services. So we should be very concerned about the role that China is in the model that it is offering to others around the world, including in Latin America. Whereas the US model is more open. Yes, we have lots of problems and lots of defects and deficiencies, but we're more predictable in the way we do business abroad, I would argue. And also we've learned some lessons in terms of how we operate in Latin America. I worked in the Clinton administration. It was a major sea change in how we thought about the region. Military dictatorships were behind us. Cold War was behind us, and we could go forward on a basis of cooperation and partnerships. So let me turn really briefly to how should we think about this currently as US government and US policymakers. It's October. We have an election next month. We have some very big issues in front of us as a country. And I think it's going to have a major effect on US-China relations, the result of our election, and US-Latin America relations. And in the shorthand version of that, and we've talked about this in our papers a little bit, the recall of the Monroe Doctrine, we don't like external actors in the region, versus call a shorthand root causes approach, which has been more the Biden-Harris administration. And these are matters of degree, and there's a lot of overlap. But one way of thinking about this is do we lead our approach to the region? Do we lead with a global threat perspective in which we look at the region through the China threat, and then we order our policies accordingly? And we've done that in the past, certainly during the Cold War, the war on drugs, the war on terrorism. And in my view, it's led to more problems than successes. Or do we look at the region saying, look, the US has longstanding interests in the region. We lead with strong bilateral and sub-regional partnerships that are win-win. I didn't say regional intentionally because we're talking about a very diverse region and lots of different governments with different ideologies and different practices. So we're talking about sub-regional interests where there are win-win outcomes. And think about the region not only from the threat perspective, but the upside potential that the region offers, the opportunities. So I would say in that approach, China rivalry is a serious problem, but it's best addressed through partnerships and cooperation. We might want to look at China, and I see a dual track approach here. We lead, particularly in the region, more in a good neighbors kind of framework, but we also are using the China card to get Congress and US policymakers to take Latin America more seriously and to invest resources and personnel and raise it up on the priority level in terms of our own approach to the region. And we can talk about the specifics of how to do that.
Well, thank you, Ted. So are you ready for the fun to begin with questions? This first question is for Valerie. Oh, so we're going to be exploring how is China leveraging its influence in Latin America? In what ways is China expanding its economic, diplomatic, security, and geopolitical influence across Latin America?
I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the economic side, that a lot of the engagement is on the economic side. On the diplomatic side, we've, of course, seen some pressuring around recognition of Taiwan. And the geopolitical side, of course, there's been stories about the spy bases in Cuba. There's been questions around Chinese disinformation, trying to influence public opinion. There's also been a shift in some of that engagement. We've seen a shift to sort of new infrastructure. I think some of that is tied to the state of the current Chinese economy. A lot of that is currently in the tech space. And so while there has been this real deepening, I think, the numbers are, I didn't write them down, but exponential growth over the past, 2-ish decades in terms of China's investments. We've really seen a shift towards smaller sector-specific, maybe a little bit safer bets around areas of strategic interest for China. And again, that would be tech, things like EVs, things like critical minerals, batteries, et cetera. And so I think that is, again, in terms of that area being a priority for China, it makes sense. It's also a key priority area for the US government in terms of supply chain resilience, in terms of, especially in thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, what that revealed in terms of, how secure the supply chain was around things that are going to be really important for future growth, future sort of visions for the world. And I think tech is currently front and center in those debates. And so Latin America is becoming, I think, a place where those two visions of what tech investment could look like are really playing out. And I think that it poses a really interesting space to watch where this kind of rivalry, again, whether it's around the norms and standards for AI governance or around 5G technology, et cetera, where all of those things are playing out right now.
Dr. Ellis?
If I could just add, because I think one of the questions when we say influence, we use that word a lot, but it's understanding how influence works and the interdependencies between areas. I mean, economically, we can measure that. We can talk about that roughly $450 billion in bilateral trade, which is about 30 times what it was when China joined the WTO. About $192 billion of sunk investment, which is still lower than Western investment, but still pretty substantial. You could talk about other things. But what comes with that, which comes with the presence of China on the ground in Latin America, number one are the relationships. And so one of the things that concerns me a lot are those, China Country X Business Council, the people who have studied in China, the people who have done media trips over to China. You begin weaving this web of people that, who are not necessarily, Chinese agents, but who are reluctant to talk critically about China or at least want to talk positively about China. And so selectively that paralyzes an effective Latin American response. And I think the other thing is important to note is that China works in an interdependent fashion at all three levels. And so there's state-to-state relations, commercially and otherwise. There is multilateral relations, not exclusively through CELAC and committees associated with CELAC. And there's also subnational relationships, sister city relationships, provincial relationships. And all of those come together to weave a web that goes far beyond just the kind of measuring the economic influence that I emphasize.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Leland, then, how does public opinion in Latin America view China increasing presence? For instance, in countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, why is it China's growing involvement often seen as a net positive when we know that there are ideological disagreements?
Yeah, I mean, you're referencing the Pew Research opinion poll, I think from a couple of years ago, right? Where they basically asked people in countries around the world, how do they view the PRC? And what's interesting is that it was like a net negative for most of the world except Mexico, Brazil, Argentina was the third, and then some African countries as well. And I mean, we have to deal with the fact that in many ways, the local partners feel like the Chinese actually put up, right? It's kind of like put up or shut up, right? They're actually coming in with infrastructure projects. They're actually coming in with the financing needed for some of the much needed infrastructure in the region. But I'm not necessarily sure that the news of some of the failed projects or some of the dark deals made are being put out into local media, probably because of what Evan was talking about, right? A lot of the trips that are financed by Chinese entities of local journalists to go over there and they're wine and dine. They spend 2 or 3 weeks in Beijing and Shanghai and they get razzle dazzle, right? Then they come back and they don't necessarily want to spend the time to dig into contracts and do the investigative journalism. I do want to say that that is changing a little bit, actually changing a lot. There are some great local organizations. I want to lift them up here. The Andrés Bello Foundation in Colombia, GAPAC in Mexico, and then also Expediente Público, which is based in Central America. I think they're doing amazing work at least offering a different view from the only positive news about Chinese projects in various countries. To Valerie's point about sort of, I guess, AI governance and then also the change in BRI. On one hand, you can argue that the BRI 2.0 actually supports the transition into renewable energy, the digitization of the region, which is what actually the region needs and wants, right? So you are seeing more investment in solar panels, in electric vehicles. There's of course a flip side to this because in many ways the BRI has always been the outward expression of China's internal economic issues. And so you're seeing that happening right now where you see a overcapacity of the 3 new types: electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries, and solar panels. And so you're seeing, of course, the export of those very same products in various Latin American countries and in the world. Actually, you're seeing a pushback. You're seeing Brazil, for example, increasing potential tariffs on the importation of EVs. You're seeing, I think, in Chile, a steel mill just shut down, right, because of the overcapacity of Chinese steel. So we have to be looking at this from, again, 2 sides of the same coin. What may be positive may also be a negative for the local economy as well. And that story needs to be told, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Only the positive is being told right now.
We actually had a story precisely about the influence of Chinese goods in Mexico, that they were displacing local businesses because they would sell them a lot more cheaper. For instance, a traditional sombrero would be $50, but one coming from China, the exact same, was sold in $3. So we do know that this is actually, hampering economies in Latin America. Ted, this question will be for you. Can you highlight some of China's economic practices, such as debt traps and market flooding with cheap goods, that are causing concern among Latin American nations?
Sure, and I also welcome any inputs from some of my colleagues who are looking at this more closely. But one that comes to mind, and going back to the public perceptions, is in Brazil, where there's been a huge increase in Brazil-China trade, and much of that has been primary commodities like iron ore, of course, is very important. So as part of the Brazilian sectors have done quite well with China. But then you talk to Brazilian businessmen who are manufacturers and in more in the industrial base, and they've kind of been decimated by the same problem of these cheap Chinese imports. And so there's a real split in how that is happening. Or you look at some of the effects of what's happening in Mexico with the changes going on with the shift toward nearshoring and bringing the political winds very strong in the United States, bring those jobs home to the United States. Oh, and Mexico right next door, benefiting from the USMCA free trade agreement. Is China now rushing some of its own investments into Mexico and taking advantage of the trade agreement and displacing actually some of Mexican indigenous economic activity, and then China gets the benefits of it. So we were talking about on the way over here, there's a free riding problem that we see with China. You know, the US tends to invest a lot of its effort in the building up institutions and governance programs, social development programs, and trying to create a better circumstance for Latin America's own development. And China does not engage in that front. And it's really concerned about its own micro industry. So there's some micro examples, but also the macro context in which Latin America is operating. The Chinese are not investing in strong institutions in the region. And I think that's another reason why we should be very concerned about China's role.
Definitely see the support that they have for Maduro's, fraudulent election, of course, the situation in Bolivia and, Cuba and other countries as well. Did you want to add something?
Oh, I have something to
Okay,
add too.
yes,
Oh,
definitely.
should I go first?
Yeah, please go.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think kind of to zoom out on some of what Ted has been saying, this has been something that has been ongoing since Fernando Enrique Cardozo was a sociology PhD in his primary work, Dependency and Development. It was about the periphery feeding the core and primary commodities being the main driver of that relationship. And so this type of engagement, the economic engagement, which may be viewed because it's activity, because it's nimble, because it can respond to local needs a little bit more as a net positive, but really it's continuing to feed this cycle of being unable to kind of move up that value chain in other areas, in being able to produce goods, manufacturing, et cetera. And so I think that it is kind of a hampering reality, and it continues this cycle that has been ongoing for decades. I mean, I think Cardozo is 100 and pushing, so decades. So.
Thank you, Dr.
It's actually ironic. When I used to teach a course on this, I actually used to assign to my students a few readings, Manuel Wallerstein, Raul Prives, Cardozo, and ironically, to see if they would capture this idea of it's important who benefits, who realizes the gain from capital, value added, et cetera, et cetera. But going back to also what Ted said, there's a macro and a micro, and I wanted to start and say a few things about both. So on the micro side, it's this question of how does China win? How does China get the best of a Latin America with weak, sometimes non-transparent institutions, et cetera, et cetera. One of those happens to be the contracting practices, and so the non-disclosure clauses, the cross-default clauses, other things. Sarkozy was merely in the way that he lost Baha Mar in the Bahamas was because there was a small clause that said, if you go to arbitration, you have to do it in Hong Kong, where they basically snatched the country away from them. So there's lots of little examples like that. There's the issue of coordination. China starts out by investing a lot in tech. They then use their opportunities at home to build up applied tech at scale. You saw them doing that in solar panels. You see them doing it now in EVs, basically running Elon Musk and Tesla with BYD, out of business. But you see that as they move beyond that also, it's the question of how do they then get individual deals? And so, for example, Huawei with its dominant position will essentially leverage the existing infrastructure it's built to basically shut others like Nokia or Ericsson out of those markets to further consolidate the gains. The list goes on and on. But so little by little, you get this kind of horizontal and vertical monopoly-seeking behavior. Leland mentioned, of course, the case in Chile of the iron and steel dumping. And if you look at the whole EV sector, I mean, there's this question of okay, if this is part of the economy of the future, so we want to do good, and Latin America wants to transition to green energy, but already the technology of EVs, the technology of solar panels, the technology of batteries, the supply chains are locked up, and so the extent to which you move towards that, who realizes the value added from the construction of the infrastructure, who realizes the value added from the sales of the EVs, and so once again, to go back to Raul Prebisch or Wallerstein or Cardoso, at the end of the day, if Latin Americans are selling their commodities and considering themselves lucky because the Chinese offer them a shiny new thing, that's part of the problem. And then at the very end, you get to the world that Ted was talking about, where you say, for example, systematically, you look at the macro figures, the deindustrialization of Brazil, that Brazil, which was an industrial power, which tried to isolate itself from dependency on the world capitalist system to achieve some of that, to realize the value added of manufacturing for itself. Systematically, since the early 2000s, it's moved towards being an exporter of soy and iron, with the Chinese companies realizing the value added even of the transport of raw iron ore, something that CVRD used to get, but now Chinese companies realize. And so it's understanding who wins at the end of the day from this engagement.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Leland, while China invests heavily in long-term projects like energy, infrastructure, and telecommunications, how is the U.S. attempting to address this growing influence, especially as it focuses more on border security and short-term issues?
Yeah. Well, let me first start off by the reaction from some local governments. And I think that some local governments are learning, right? They're learning how to better address some of these concerns, right? I'll give you a specific example. Everybody knows about the increase of Chinese engagement in lithium, right? The lithium triangle. A perfect example of this is the company Tianqi that has a 23% stake in SQM, right? The Chilean company. Well, apparently, right now, Codelco, which is, I think, a Chilean state-run critical mineral company, is trying to kind of wrest that percentage of stake away because they were realizing, oh my goodness, lithium is too important of a critical mineral for us to have a foreign company really have a significant stake in it. Of course, that's now going through legal issues, right? Tianqi is trying to fight really hard in order to make sure to maintain that. But I think that's an example of our partners, waking up, right, and sort of realizing that they need to defend themselves in that way. The U.S. has also been realizing that, hey, we need to also put up or shut up, right? And you're seeing specifically the U.S. Development Finance Corporation setting up a strategic partnership with the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, where they're basically providing risk insurance to private companies. They say, okay, this big project is a little bit too risky. Okay, we'll give you up to $500 million in risk insurance that you feel more comfortable in investing in a certain project. The DFC is also working with Taiwan, the Taiwan International Cooperation and Development Fund, which is their version of our USAID, right? On joint projects in the 7 countries that are diplomatic allies of Taiwan still. And specifically in the critical mineral space, DFC has been working in Brazil, which has also some lithium, also cobalt, and other critical minerals, to basically give $1 billion to a company called TechMech in order to extract those minerals, but in a more, I guess, sustainable and cleaner way, right? So I think these are the ways in which we're also trying to provide a viable alternative. Is it enough right now? Of course not. I think we're just getting started. And I also think that the US doesn't have to go it alone, right? Japan, for example, everybody thinks of Japan as mostly focused on overseas development assistance in Southeast Asia, right? But the largest Japanese diaspora outside of Japan, Brazil, right? And Japanese companies, of course, the auto companies have various factories and whatnot in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. And so I think Japan can do more. South Korea has a $4 billion lithium mine in Argentina, in Hombre Muerto. Taiwan, again, there can be more Taiwanese investment, especially as the US is working with various Latin American countries like your native Mexico, but also Costa Rica, Panama, and Dominican Republic in order to play a bigger role in the semiconductor industry,
Mhm.
right? So I understand that some Taiwanese semiconductor and semiconductor adjacent companies are looking at investment opportunities in this region. I think those are all the ways in which we can try to outcompete the PRC.
Can we stay on this for a minute on the U.S. response?
Yes, yes, yes.
And just to add a couple more things. One is on, I was saying before, the macro conditions in many of these countries, rule of law is a huge challenge. I mean, when you look at the studies of the quality of governance and rule of law, Latin America scores very lowly. The influence of organized crime and trafficking of all sorts is a major problem in the region, and it directly affects the United States, including our migration problem. And so where does China fit into that? Well, we know with precursors, for example, fentanyl, it's a huge problem. And yes, the US and China are talking about that. So that's an area where actually cooperation could happen. And supposedly, according to the reporting, they are beginning to control these flows into Latin America from China and into the US. Good. We can do more of that and look for other areas. But at the end of the day, I think obviously the US is much more directly affected than China is when it comes to these kinds of trafficking flows. So we've got to address that and step up more seriously in terms of our own cooperation with the region on law enforcement specifically. We don't have a counterpart to Southcom and other military assets that we have in the region, even in the public diplomacy space. And we could do much more when it comes to judicial cooperation, prosecutors, et cetera, to really help these countries address what is a very serious threat to their own stability. I mean, there are areas of certain countries, Mexico, for example, Colombia, in which there is no state presence. These are towns and counties run by organized crime in collusion with politicians. This is a serious concern. If these spaces are not state managed or controlled or governed, then we're dealing with a vast array of lawlessness that is directly affecting us. So I want to really underscore that point. And also customs and ports, is another area where the Chinese have had a huge influence. What can we do to help those regulators actually screen that flow? It's a major concern. And one last point, which is we in the United States have learned that we have to pay much more attention to Chinese and other types of foreign investments coming in to this country. And so we have a screening mechanism to do that. I hope we are talking to Latin American governments about their own screening mechanisms so that and also to make it more transparent. So as researchers, it's very difficult to really understand and know the details of these deals. And we need much better infrastructure and information about screening these types of flows.
Valerie?
Yeah, and I agree with all this, and I think it's important and wonderful. But at the same time, Secretary Blinken, the timing of it was unfortunate, but released his kind of treatise on the renewed foreign policy of the United States and foreign affairs a couple of days ago, coincided with some escalation in the Middle East, unfortunately. And China was in there more than 30 times. Latin America was in there twice. I think one of those references was about the UN Security Council reform, nothing about regional cooperation. Mexico, the US's biggest trading partner, not in there at all. Brazil, also a big actor in this space, especially in terms of thinking about the South-South collaboration, geopolitical dynamics, not in there at all. And so while there are these areas and there is recognition, I think in Washington, we keep having these conversations about China's influence and how it's shaping Latin America, and we must do more. It's still not like as of 3 days ago, still not factoring into the grand foreign policy vision of the region and the regional dynamics.
Dr. Ellis.
Yeah, I think this really highlights a key thing that while there's a lot of agreement among us, I think there are also some important policy debates in terms of how the U.S. responds. And frankly, I don't think either Republican nor Democratic administrations have yet effectively slowed down too much. I think the response is still evolving. But I think there are certain things that we agree on across administrations and certain things we don't. I think there's a general agreement that it's probably counterproductive to try to block partners from dealing with China, that's not only not possible, but it generates resentment. I think there's a general agreement that there's something to be said about the strengthening institutions approach for the U.S. to be a better partner in terms of helping evaluation of contracts, helping evaluation of investments, helping evaluations of competing bids, helping to work against corruption, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a certain agreement that there's something about root causes that has promise. The question is how much and what do you do? As a matter of fact, if you look at the record, although everyone from Chile and Uruguay to Venezuela deals with China, some of the most problematic activities from looking at Venezuela, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, others, Nicaragua now, actually come from those states those regimes that come about after citizens lose faith in democracy. And so there's something to be said for helping democracies, and especially pro-use democracies, to succeed as a way of managing the China risk. However, the alternative to that is saying there's just not enough money to solve everyone's root causes in a way to base a policy in that. One of the other questions is, to what degree do you do specific things with institutions? So development finance corporations is a great example. And I think the idea both that started in the Trump administration with Rachel Claver-Caron and others, and it's continued in the Biden administration, this idea of leverage the private sector because we can't just gift our way out of competing with China. But the problem is, for example, an organization like Development Finance Corporation, to what degree do you prioritize trying to get to incentivize private money going to just low-income countries, to just at-risk minorities, to just certain groups that, in the name of doing social good? Or to what degree do you move away from those priorities in order to facilitate private sector money going to where it does? And so where are those balances? How do you do those things within, I think, the domain of what we generally agree on?
Leland, you mentioned a lot Taiwan, and I want to ask you, how is China using the relationships that they have with Latin American countries to isolate Taiwan diplomatically?
I'll start off with a story. Honduras, right? One of the most recent changes. Xiomara Castro, as a candidate, was saying, hey, if I get into power, I will switch diplomatic recognition. And then she gets into power, and maybe the first year, talk about that decreases. But then you start seeing some warning signs, right? You start seeing the Honduran foreign minister meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi during the sidelines of Lula's inauguration. You start to see then an increase of certain local businessmen trying to figure out certain projects, right? So there is a playbook, a consistent playbook that PRC entities use in order to lay the groundwork for when they want to try to snatch a certain country, or at least pressure a certain country to switch diplomatic recognition. Right now, of course, of the 12 diplomatic allies that Taiwan has left in the world, 7 of them are in this region. Guatemala would probably be the one, since it's the largest economy of the 7. And sort of you're seeing a guy, for example, Jorge Mondal Chu, who used to be a Huawei executive based in Guatemala. He's Guatemalan. And he also was a banker, and he was actually just kind of kicked out of the Guatemalan government of Arevalo because of potential corruption charges, right? But the whole point is to try to identify who these local fixers are who are trying to make those moves now in order to try to make those switches and try to be proactive in order to prevent them. That's one. 2 is, I think that in terms of strategic communication, Taiwan and the US can absolutely do a better job at telling a more positive story. I think the narrative for years has been that China's economic rise is inevitable, and so you might as well hitch your cart to that horse sooner rather than later. Taiwan is so small. But I think now that narrative is really shifting. Obviously, Taiwan being a global leader in the semiconductor industry, TSMC, more potential Taiwanese investment in Mexico and in other areas. And on the flip side, you see a decreasing China when it comes to economics, right? The housing bubble with Evergrande and Country Garden, the growing municipal and provincial debt, the decrease in foreign direct investment, the 20% youth unemployment, as Ted mentioned, right? The fact that Wall Street can't even really trust Chinese numbers and GDP. A couple of months ago, there was again the 20% youth unemployment. They didn't like those numbers, and so they used a different methodology to then use it again and say, no, it wasn't that bad, right? We're not gonna account for, say, Chinese students who just graduated and don't have a job yet, right? So all that to say that the narrative is still quite positive in Latin America and the Caribbean about China's economic situation. There needs to be more news about the very real concerns that China is not going to be able or might not be able to escape the middle income trap. And what would that mean for economic engagement with Latin America going forward?
Thank you. Ted, how is China's presence in the region undermining U.S. objectives? And are there viable alternatives for Latin American countries looking for investment options beyond China?
Yeah, that's a great question. We think so much, we talk about US, China, but of course there are important other players. We talked about Japan and Korea, but there's also Europe. And the European Union has long-standing ties in the region, economic and political and otherwise, development assistance. In general, European Union and European governments have both pulled back on some of the development assistance. In particular countries, there was a day, for example, when the Europeans were big players in Central America when it comes to development assistance, and they've mostly stepped back from that. Oh, the Americans can take care of that. But you are seeing renewed interest in some of the trading and economic relationships from European companies. And there's been this endless discussion, negotiation of a trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur. And it's back on, it's off again, on again. I continue to have real doubts that that's ever going to happen. I think France is just too powerful a player to say they do not want Latin American fruit and banana. It's just too competitive. They will lose that battle, the French farmers. So politically, I don't think it's going to happen, but they're still at it. So I think that when you sit, you look at the point of view of Latin American governments. I had a conversation with a former president of Costa Rica last week, and he was recounting this concern that they have, particularly a small country, of balancing against around all these forces so that they don't get stomped on by one or the other. And that's true on economic terms and political terms as well. I want to add one other element of this, which doesn't get much attention, which is what happens at the UN. Most of Latin America is part of the G77 block of states, and they negotiate a lot of common positions at the UN. China is a major voice and power player in the G77. And so you take an issue like human rights, and there's a battle always at the UN on human rights, but one that is on right now is budget, and how much money will the UN human rights system get from New York and from the member states. China is pushing hard to cut that budget as much as possible, and leaning on the Latin governments to agree with them, and other countries like Chile or Argentina and others who are actually quite pro international human rights. They believe in the system, it's helped them in their own development, are struggling to push back against China in these fora. So it's a small little window into what I think is a much larger problem, that this is competition and rivalry that we're facing. China has a vision for changing the international order. Read the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. These are Xi Jinping's three main arguments for what needs to change. And some of it sounds fuzzy and doesn't sound so bad. Other parts, if you read between the lines, We know, and I've done some deep study on this and looking at China's role in the international human rights system, that China has a different concept that basically says civil society doesn't belong. This is absolutely just between member states. Get NGOs out of the picture entirely. Number two, no such thing as UN monitors in countries. No, 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 no. This is only national sovereignty issues. This is our internal affairs. Go away. We don't want to hear from any of you. We have a whole system that's been developed over decades where we have an international criminal court. We have all kinds of monitors, special rapporteurs that actually help states get out of human rights crises. And China wants to end all that. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, this is a different way of thinking about the world. And I think we have to be honest and confront it if we want to keep with some of the more positive aspects of the international system.
True. Valerie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I would add on the Europe side, one of the things that I've heard from people in the region is actually, the country that has been really, I think, the most effective on the European side has been Spain. In fact, and so, I think that there's an interesting relationship and an interesting dynamic there that could be kind of built upon in terms of thinking about ways to bring many of these countries into some of these conversations that are happening in Europe. On the UN side, it's complicated because you hear a lot, especially from the Brazilian perspective. It's like the UN is the vessel to do many things. And so, while I think there's a lot of pressure, I also think there has been a lot of effort put into the UN system in terms of what its promise could be. And so I do think that that's a potential area of tension where a country like, and we'll see, and, it depends on who's in power. And of course, the dynamics of especially Brazil are changing quite often. But, in terms of hope in the UN system, I think that that is a place that we've actually seen a lot of attention toward. And so it could be an area of potential real tension with China, especially around some of these reforms in areas that I think that a lot of countries in the region have invested a lot in, like human rights.
Leland?
Yeah, I wanted to, this actually brings up an interesting point of the way that PRC and PRC entities are using different multilateral fora, right? And maybe they might not necessarily like UN forum, but they certainly use CELAC, right?
The BRICS.
Or BRICS, exactly. But I mentioned CELAC specifically because I think just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, they actually had a forum about human rights. And Ted, I mean, they were talking about there is an international definition of human rights, not just the Western definition, and of course, not including NGOs. It's only an internal affair. And another thing that's interesting is some of my State Department colleagues, specifically the ones who are in Latin America and the Caribbean, sometimes they'll want to do a movie screening about, say, the plight of the Uyghurs. And for some reason, I can make an educated guess why, those events are never really well attended. There isn't much receptivity on the part of local countries on the plight of the Uyghurs or Tibetans or any of the human rights issues that are going on within China. And I wonder, of course, that definitely has to do with a concerted effort from the PRC to control the narrative there. Last thing I want to mention, you guys both mentioned the importance of the EU, and the EU has the Global Gateway, right, in which they pledged 45 billion euro for renewable energy projects, electricity grids, safe and sustainable extraction of critical minerals. So really the same areas where, of course, both the US through APEP and then the PRC through the BRI are all going to be investing in. I wonder, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues in the audience here, does that mean that there may be an over-investment in those renewable projects going forward, right? And what will that do to the region?
Dr. Ellis?
I think this whole issue of forums is something that not enough attention has been given to, but China does use forums as one of the strategic spaces in which it competes. Going back to Ted's point, one of the things you actually see is on the one hand, China does compete in the UN system. As a matter of fact, they are constantly effective in using bureaucratic maneuvering, for example, within the World Health Organization, within the UN body to suppress certain things, to push certain things in directions that they wanted to, while at the same time in other areas, they try to get away from the UN, or for example, they have been an observer at the Organization of American States since 2004, and matter of fact, have a huge diplomatic contingent in Washington that are OAS delegates. Whether what that they actually do is another issue. But it's interesting that they prefer not to work through the OAS where the US and Canada are present, but they do a lot through CELAC, which is number one, not effectively institutionalized. And so you bring everybody in the region together to get basically the Chinese posture without much opportunity or institutional coordination to figure out what the region wants to demand from China, and also, of course, without the United States in the space. But you also see, for example, in other forums. So in the Inter-American Development Bank, which the Chinese joined officially in 2009, and it was there's usually kind of a two-step process. Number one is prevent the organizations from studies or other things that are critical of China. So it's interesting, you look at the pre-2009 IADB reports about the impact of China and the post-IADB. ECLAC is another, United Nations. It's ironic that ECLAC was one of the major promoters of the work of people like Cardozo and the dangers of dependent development. It's amazing how much ECLAC reports got away from all that once ECLAC became a major Chinese partner in the region. And the list goes on and on. But I think the thing to understand is how the Chinese they do the same thing with FOCAC in Africa. They do the same thing with the 17+1, now the 14+1, if it's still going on in Europe. But just understanding that this is one strategic space among many in which the Chinese seek to maneuver. But the common underlying thing, just like with the commercial side we talked about before, is the pursuit of China's own strategic interests and making basically a world safe for the advance of China.
Thank you, Valerie. But before, I would like to ask you something
Oh,
because the name was
okay.
mentioned, right? And
Is it?
in Latin America, a lot of things are based on appearances, influence, and presence as well. So given that President Xi Jinping has visited Latin America and the Caribbean 13 times in the past 12 years, while the US leadership has made fewer visits in comparison, we're talking about 9 visits in 12 years and 3 in the past 8 years. Is this indicative of China's stronger commitment to the region? And how is this impacting the US influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think the 3 in the past 8 years is, I mean, 12 to 9, okay. 3 in the past 8 years is quite stark. And I think that gets back to the idea that this is sort of not a central priority for US foreign policy. I think, President Biden will be heading to Brazil soon, so we're going to get a 4th, which is great. But, I think that it just is kind of indicative of the fact that it isn't a priority. Again, it didn't show up in Secretary Blinken's treatise on renewed US foreign policy. And so while, again, we could talk about a lot of these spaces and the ways that some of these multilateral fora are thinking about investing in Latin America, it's still not central. The region is still not central to US foreign policy. And I think to get back to Ted's earlier point as well, like if we can use the China hook to get that attention, and I feel like this has been a conversation for the past decade at least, is let's just try one more time with that China hook. Maybe this time it will work, especially because I do think that the technology space, sort of to your point, maybe a little bit about oversaturation, but the technology space is so important and weighing so heavily in a lot of the ways that countries are thinking about their future opportunities. Maybe this time it will work. We will see. But I do think it's a focused sector, an acute challenge that has really reshaped, especially the way the U.S. has thought about industrial policy, whether through the CHIPS and Science Act or the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think that there's a potential area to finally make some inroads. After a lot of talk about the way that the region has, China has infiltrated the region with investments. This is a problem. We recognize it's a problem. And we've continued to recognize it's a problem for the past decade and a half. But it's still, the region shows up twice again in that sort of manifesto. One thing also to get back to some of the challenges on these multilateral organizations, the BRICS, I kind of mentioned them. I think that's an interesting case because we see Brazil and we see India kind of teaming up together in thinking about how this group will take shape and what their mandate is. And so I do think there's some interest, there's interesting dynamics, and maybe it's because India is in the fold and India is has a potentially stronger hand to play in some of these conversations. But I think that there is some resistance. And so we'll see how that plays out as well. Maybe that's not as, the resistance is not necessarily as strong in something like a CELAC, but in the BRICS, where India is in this conversation, Brazil has an ally in some of the ways that it's thinking about actually shaping this organization. So,
Ted, is it already too late for the US to counter all of this growing influence of China in Latin America?
Absolutely not. No, it's not too late. And I think, as we've been talking about, there is a rising interest and concern about China's role in the region and other parts of the world. And you see it in Congress. There are a number of debates and bills going forward on how the US should address this. So I think that's a positive sign, despite this ongoing, the foreign policy establishment not taking Latin America seriously enough. It certainly takes China seriously. And so, and that's what I was referring to earlier. There's a trap there that we don't want to fall into, that we just look at the region through a China frame. That would be a mistake, in my view. And Latins will not cooperate with that approach. They won't. They need China. And so we don't want to put them in a box and say, you've got to choose one or the other. And we've seen US policymakers try that approach. It doesn't work. So I think we have to be smart about it and nuanced and go in with a more positive vision and strategy. And I think, we've got an election and next month, and this will determine very much the vision and the tactics, the rhetoric, that one administration, I think, will take one approach, as I referred to. Maybe we've seen a lot of discussion, people close to the Trump campaign talking about the Monroe Doctrine versus this root causes type of approach, which I think probably from the Latin American perspective has a better chance of success.
Beautiful. Well, with that being said, it's already 12:15, so we would like to open up the floor for questions for our panelists.
don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And,
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I wanted to thank you all for being here today, for especially on your insights for those of us that are researching China-Latin America relations. My name is Miguel Escoto. I'm a junior with the Jack D. Gordon Institute. I'm a fellow. My research is regarding Chinese influence in Nicaragua. So my question is, are there any patterns or trends seen with Chinese cooperation with regimes like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua in comparison with other nations in the region?
Dr. Ellis?
Absolutely. So in general terms, while China engages on its own terms with well-institutionalized democratic nations like Chile or Uruguay, as well as nations like Venezuela and Nicaragua, what you see is the pattern and the results are very different. And so number one, there's a tendency that populist states tend to go much farther in terms of security cooperation. So, Venezuela, for example, was the first to buy the K-8 fighters. Ecuador under Rafael Correa was the first to buy a large lot of Chinese trucks. Bolivia under Evo Morales was the first to buy the Chinese military helicopters. And you see some of the same things now, as well as with acquisitions of surveillance systems, other things. Number two is the Chinese tend to get a lot better of a deal when they deal, although with headaches, with authoritarian states for a number of reasons. Number one, those authoritarian states tend to self-isolate themselves from Western capital, which means that you tend to get better terms, that China gets better terms. Number two is oftentimes the states are politically well receptive, willing to do state-to-state deals and under limited transparency, which again opens up the door for personal benefit. So the big Chinese deal maker from Tianjin, Lorena Ortega, of course, comes to mind with respect to Nicaragua. Again, the canal deal, in which there was the rumor that just having the rights to the land around Brito, where the Pacific Coast port was going to be, it was a money-making opportunity for the Ortegas to indirectly buy in cheap and then make lots of money later. So you see the question of, and also frankly with, I talked about before the lawfare that the Chinese do. And so again, when you have politicized bureaucracies of, sons and brother-in-laws who are making the technical decisions about the contract, again, you get more of the side benefits, but conditions that reward Chinese companies. And so if you look at, some of the deals that were just abandoned by corruption, for example, in Venezuela, you look at, again, I mentioned the Tanaco train, CVG and other things, or some of the things that happened in Ecuador with, especially under Jorge Glass as vice president, under Rafael Correa with Coca-Cola Sinclair. And so you look at Nicaragua right now and you see the exact same pattern. You see these mysterious, non-transparent mining deals. I think there's a total of 12 deals now, including in some very remote areas of the Ran and Ras, and under what conditions are they operating? What are they actually doing there? What type of corporate social responsibility is going on there, by contrast to something like mining in Chile, or these new projects where the Chinese are going to build the Punta Cueta airport, or the new train that connects Managua to the lake in the south, or the new coastal highway, et cetera, et cetera. And again, how many Nicaraguans will be employed? What will be the loan, the conditions of the loan deal, et cetera, et cetera. The Nicaraguans signed this FTA, but there has been, I think, a total of literally $50 million, almost nothing in terms of the actual Nicaraguan exports to China, because at the end of the day, it's mostly about China coming in. And so I think when you look at the deals, the bottom line is that those type of countries, what you see is you see a lot more defense deals, you see a lot more technology leadership, you see China having a lot more latitude to do things within the country in terms of, and you see the same thing in Honduras right now with telecommunications companies and electricity contracts, and these kind of non-transparent weaving of influence among people who are close to the Ortegas. And frankly, at the end of the day, you see very little actual benefit on the Chinese side, very little control of the projects. And so I think there is a big difference of doing things with China, from strong institutions and transparency versus when populist governments do these state-to-state deals that largely benefit the leaders of those populist governments.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Next question, please.
First off, thank you for being here. Ted, when you mentioned the good neighbor policy, I was really excited to hear that. But there's a couple of elements of the good neighbor policy that are just not feasible right now, and we're not seeing them in Congress. And the three that I want to highlight are: one, the willingness to open up the U.S. unilaterally to trade from the region. There's no appetite for trade at the United States. I don't see that changing. The willingness to work with countries that may disagree with us on issues. FDR is famous for his quote, "He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." And the willingness to engage with the U.S. public. And this comes to Leland's point about messaging, is how do we encourage the US public to put forward a good message about the region when our messaging at home about the region is so bad? Whether we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine, which is coming from both parties, whether we're talking about everything through the China lens. You can't get anything through Congress without the China lens at this point. Our conversations on immigration, we don't need to get into how bad those have come and how they're being interpreted from the region. But what does that mean for us? How do we create this message at home so that our news outlets are also projecting that information abroad?
Right. Well, yes, we're in a very different historical context than the good neighbor policy, which was coming out of the Depression and leading up into World War II. And the United States was very much looking for allies, and also looking back at the record of the 1920s when we militarily intervened in several countries in the region and trying to move on from that. So there were important features of good neighbor policy that I think got us out of the worst aspects of US interventionism. Very different today. We're in a much more protectionist mood, and also putting up border walls, et cetera. So much of our migration flow does come from from Latin America. But maybe that's also a resource that we're not drawing enough on. You think about the very high number of very successful Latinos in the United States who could become goodwill ambassadors or bridge builders. It's in the public and the private sector and universities. And I think instead of it being, I don't like to use this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, because ghettoized in like, oh, this is just that community of interest. I think our own politics are changing, and we have a huge number of voters, legal citizens who are particularly who happen to be from the region, but have a voice and a stake in this country. And I think they have a huge potential in changing US policy in more positive ways and the image of the United States.
Valerie, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think that we have this very distinct asset that China can never have, which is those personal and cultural ties. And so thinking about ways to leverage those better, I think is really important, whether it's through the sort of high profile people in the Latino community who are, very prominent in the US and also can speak to the dynamics there. Or, I think that the Peace Corps, it just announced, I believe, is now going back to El Salvador, which is, having these types of positive engagements that involve those people-to-people dynamics is, I think, really important. I saw also recently mayors are going to be collaborating around migration questions. So where that type of collaboration can be productive, depoliticized, and focused on finding solutions, I think we should think about boosting those areas because they are, we saw a summit. I think it was governors or was it mayors? But in any case, just like building on those types of efforts where there are efforts to focus on actual solutions to some of these challenges versus a lot of the rhetoric, I think amplifying those is really important too.
Leland?
Well, so for example, there was that city summit of the Americas in Denver last year, right?
Yes.
They brought in like 50 mayors from the US and 50 mayors from Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So they can actually create those people.
I think that helps, especially when at the top in either context, in any country, whether it's a country in Latin America or in the US where there's sort of the bombastic rhetoric of the president or whomever, to have those types of links, I think is really important.
Yeah. I think that there needs to be a fundamental reshift about explaining or telling the region that it's a region of problems instead of a region of promise, right? I really do think that there is a real opportunity with the nearshoring, with Mexico in particular, with Costa Rica, with Panama, with the Dominican Republic, and others who can potentially get on board to really play integral parts in the supply chains of the future, specifically in terms of semiconductors. I will say that there's an issue in terms of messaging both domestically and overseas about this. Last week, I had a conversation with a colleague who's working at Commerce. And of course, Commerce is the one that's divvying out the 50 billion for the CHIPS Act, right? And there's also an international component to this, right? That's run by the State Department, ITSE, right? International Technology, ITSE, International Technology, something. But it's to basically to help to provide funding for countries that can play big roles in this supply chain, right? They're having an issue here though, because they want to strike a good balance to say, yes, we're supporting a partner in developing, let's say, semiconductor adjacent industries, right? So not necessarily the chip itself, but the assembly, the testing, the packaging, the production of the chemicals that are needed in order to create the chips. But at the same time, not necessarily saying to the everyday American people, oh yeah, all those jobs that you would have had are actually helping our partners abroad to create them. So you got to strike that balance. I don't necessarily know what's the best way to do that, but it's definitely an issue that we have to deal with going forward. But again, that reshift, it's not just a region of problems, of drugs and thugs, of irregular migration, right? It's also a region of promise, and we need to be thinking that way.
Thank you, Leland. Next question. Yeah, right here.
So I want to thank you for your time. And my question is, what specific posture do you think the United States should take to, with regards to its foreign policy, to deter China's debt trap diplomacy and its attempts to influence Western democracies? And also, is what we're seeing today in Latin America not sort of a manifestation of the fear of the red wave, which was stressed in the 80s at the height of the Cold War? And what specific role do you think US intelligence agencies should have to deter China? Thank you.
Dr. Ellis?
Okay, yeah, we jumped in. And great question. There's a lot of stuff to unpack. First, as a colleague of mine once said, if you think it's a problem if the United States doesn't pay attention to Latin America, wait till you see what happens when the United States does pay attention to Latin America. So I think there's a issue of doing things right and doing things smartly. And I think a number of my colleagues here have talked about some of the elements of US policy, but let me just kind of lay a few things out. And again, I think knowledgeable people will differ. Again, I served under the Trump administration. Ted served under the Clinton administration, and so we have a few different perspectives here. But that's what makes this interesting when we can all get along as friends. But so number one, I think there's a level of agreement, as we talked about before. Basically not saying, okay, you shall not have legitimate economic interaction with China. I think a key focus needs to be on strengthening institutions. So again, evaluation of contracts, control of corruption, issues with evaluation of competing alternatives, et cetera, to help the United States be a partner to Latin America, getting the best from whoever it does business with in the hemisphere that we're connected with by family, by commerce on a level playing field. I think that's really the only way that we can do it. I think we need to do a better job on the information front, both in terms of the messaging, as well as in terms of database message, why certain projects with China, why doing things in a non-transparent way without being on top of your game is not in Latin America's interest. Kind of some of the comparative records. Why, frankly, there's a lot of good news stories about why U.S. companies and U.S. investment, when it happens, is in the region's interest. We tend to provide more value added, more protection inherently, the corporate social responsibility, more safeguards against corruption and things like that. So I think it's getting those messages out there more effectively. Frankly, it's doing things strategically more effectively as well. And so the question of where do we invest our limited resources? So for example, I remember again during the Trump administration, I think we did a pretty good job when Ecuador was trying to escape Lenin Moreno. I mean, his parents didn't name him Lenin for nothing, but he was a decent man who was trying to get himself out of a snare of dependency and corruption that Correa had left him in. And I think we reached out, the Trump administration, at a key moment. Similar situation with Guyana. So it's kind of recognizing where there are opportunities. I think Argentina was a similar story. So recognizing where the strategic opportunities are. And I think another thing where people will, again, where respectable people will agree or disagree, is it's not, root causes is important. I think you actually will find people, on the Republican side as well that, say, we need to help Democratic partners succeed. We need to bring prosperity to the region. The difficult question becomes of where are the balances? And so, for example, questions of, do we promote green energy if that means, helping to facilitate a China-friendly government by China-friendly projects in non-transparent ways that actually undermines, our case? Where do we make those balances or draw the line? In terms of the role of intelligence community, I think there are, multiple different roles. I mean, number one is getting the information to help decision makers, both on the DoD and other side, about what the Chinese are doing, to help us communicate that to leaders, to have effective decision points, and also to help us to have sensitive information that we can communicate to others in the region about what the risks are of China in their own countries. Obviously, we can't talk about those types of things here, but having that information to allow our partners, and frankly, also it is the flow of valued cooperation and intelligence. So if you go with that great Huawei network, there are certain things that maybe we can't share with you. If you're sending people to the Chinese courses in Champagne, maybe we can't train those military people. And so it's providing the intelligence community, providing something of value, working with our partners, whether it's in working against drugs or other things, that also provides a leverage of why you want to work with us and not work with China. So I think absolutely absolutely, there is a critical role for intelligence, there's a critical role for military, but it's in the context of a coordinated whole of government effort and one that's coordinated with our partners. Leland before has mentioned, working with the Koreans, working with the Japanese, working with the Taiwanese. There's certain places that their development organization can triangulate with investors in another country and underwrite something, et cetera, or provide us insights and information, or we them. And so there's lots of ways that we can do those type of things together, working together as a whole, to have a level playing field for all. I'll stop at that point, but a great question.
I just had 2 quick points to that. Just a foot stomp, all the things that you're saying. But to your point specifically about the new red wave, that's actually a real concern that I've been trying to grapple with, because I am really concerned about this potential new age of McCarthyism. Because yes, the PRC has been leveraging the Chinese diaspora either here within the US and in Latin America and the Caribbean in order to further its political goals. Anybody's been watching the news, right? Linda Sun, the case of Linda Sun in New York a couple of weeks ago, right? Been working in the governor's office, right? And sort of serving as an agent of the PRC. There are many examples of that also in Latin America and the Caribbean. So how do we strike that balance of understanding that and protecting our national security, but at the same time not demonizing, not persecuting the Chinese diaspora? That's point 1. And 2, point 2 to Evan's point about allies and partners. Let's face it. Most of the time, the U.S. is actually not the best messenger about these things, because it can easily be misconstrued as we're trying to reimpose Monroe Doctrine, right? I think a better way is to actually leverage Latin American and Caribbean countries' relationships with other global South countries, specifically African countries. We every year, actually it'll be just the second year, but we host the Africa Americas Forum on China, right? Where we bring together local African experts from Nigeria, from Ethiopia, from Kenya, their Latin American and Caribbean counterparts, and they talk to each other. Because we keep on saying that Latin America and the Caribbean in 5 years is what Africa is today in terms of Chinese involvement. So there are lessons that Latin American and Caribbean countries can learn now from their African counterparts. So I think we can do more of that.
Valerie?
Time to debate. I'll say I am not concerned or as concerned about a new red wave as I am concerned about this growing, especially right-leaning populist, anti-democratic challenge to the region. We've seen that in Argentina, we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in El Salvador, we've seen it in many places. It's a broad network. It's a networked community across the US, across Europe, in Latin America. Latin America is really an area where we've seen the most progress. And in the veil of this conversation, those leaders can talk tough about China, and they do very much talk tough, but we have not seen any lack of engagement. We've seen a continued engagement with Milei. We've seen Bukele say, I'd like to go to China. And so, I think that to me is the more urgent challenge in terms of sort of ideological governance, and where there might be opportunities for China to think about this kind of Nicaraguization, the ability to get better deals so that you can prop up some of these leaders who are maybe undermining the rule of law. And so that to me is where I see the looming challenge.
Thank you, Valerie. Somebody else, question right here? Yeah, sure.
So I just had a
We'll do it.
So I just had a brief question about how the U.S. might prevent institutional capture in terms of multilateral institutions, because by the admission of most of this panel, the kind of corruption we're looking at and type of institutional capture we're looking at doesn't necessarily look like Chinese officials are handing over briefcases of cash. It looks like they are co-opting individuals and sending them on media tours, wining and dining them in Shanghai. So how exactly can the US build those institutions in more resistant manners?
Ted?
Yeah, I'll jump in, but do you want to take more than one question?
Sure, let's do that because actually we have
Yeah.
to wrap it up. So these are the last two questions and then we'll be,
Make this,
thank you.
I'll make this quick. How does the potential use of malicious devices, mass surveillance systems, and spyware, whether it's Chinese-backed or not, impact Latin America, U.S. interests, as well as U.S. intelligence efforts to stay ahead of China? And also, does this presence in China, in Latin America, pose any supply chain risks to U.S. citizens, given the rise of cheaply manufactured goods through companies like Temu, TikTok, Shein, et cetera?
Okay, who would like to start? And let's try to just make short answers so that we can answer both questions. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Ted?
yeah, that's fine. Those are two interesting questions. So I would just make a broad point about the US advantages and disadvantages in response to these kinds of problems. We are really a quite decentralized system. And when it comes to our actions abroad, even though it looks like we've got mighty Washington and all of the kind of political security elements, it's quite dispersed in terms of how relations happen. And I think it's a strength, but it's also much harder to coordinate a common approach. So when you think about, just take the analogy of the wining and dining, you know, there's a very centralized system China has that they can kind of coordinate all of that. Whereas on our end, say it's the private sector that's much more in the lead when it comes to economic and trading relationships. And the Commerce Department or other parts of this government acts as more of a facilitator and, you know, providing risk insurance or whatever the particulars are of a situation. So that just makes it a bit harder. But we have ways of working very closely with the private sector, with civil society, so that we can get a little bit closer aligned and on the same page. I mean, people have different interests, but I think there's, generally speaking, a goodwill toward the region, at least those who are already invested in the region. And that would be the way to address that approach.
I guess, guys, this is it. We're actually past, 10 minutes, but, we would like to have just a minute of final thoughts before we close the panel. Can we start with you, Leland? Just
Just
Conclusion.
real quick, I just want to
Fine.
put stance this idea of reimagining the region, not just as a region of problems, but a region of promise. And I do think that the U.S. doesn't have to do it alone, right? Again, we can bring in our allies and partners. This kind of blended financing is actually already happening in the Indo-Pacific. Just look up sort of projects that say the DFC plus JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, plus the Australians are all funding like 5G operations in Southeast Asia. We can do that same thing in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we'll go a long way in outcompeting China in the region.
Leland, thank you. Valerie?
Yeah, I would just say, it's hard to compete on pricing. And so I think that the US has to think about other more attractive alternatives, whether it's in very strategic industries. Leland, I think, gave a great exposition on what could be involved in terms of the semiconductor side, thinking about bringing regional powers, countries that are interested in the space, especially into governance conversations, emphasizing the importance of especially digital sovereignty and these types of more, maybe not financial carrots, but sort of thinking about the way that these countries want to operate in a global context and working toward that, because a digitally sovereign Brazil, a Brazil with its own infrastructure and its own capabilities, is better than one that's relying on China and these types of surveillance technologies or 5G networks, et cetera. And so if we can promote that type of engagement, I think that is much more sustainable than any type of sort of stick version that says, if you do this, we can't work with you at all.
Thank you, Valerie. Dr. Ellis.
So a couple of things real quick. First of all, in terms of overall solutions, as I think we talked about, obviously more money through vehicles like CHIPS Act, et cetera, Build Back Better World. rethinking coordination both internally, state defense, commerce, as well as internationally, as we've talked about. Frankly, rethinking authorities, as we talked about, what are we really trying to achieve through DFC? What's the balance with DFC, USAID, other between doing good and competing? I think that merits a certain policy debate. And then thinking about again how you identify select opportunities to make a difference and where where you simply can't. And frankly, I think values has to come into, and I think frankly, it's emphasizing democracy, the role of the individual, and frankly, the role of the, private economy is important. But we need to rethink. We can't do it the same way that we did it during the Cold War. A gray Soviet Union, industrialized, et cetera, versus I think China with their tech offering and with the progress that they've made bringing 800 million people out of poverty, we need to rethink how we argue to Latin America that why the protection of human rights, why adherence to procedural democracy, why frankly individual-based initiative in terms of an economy is in your self-interest. And then very briefly with respect to institution capture, again, I am very worried about kind of the networks of influence. It's not just about the rational actor approach, and it's not, it's all of the above. It is the trips to China. It's the silencing and expected benefit. It is the little things of cash. It's the the side benefit contract for your brother-in-law's organization. It's the United Front work that goes out through the local chamber of commerce. It's that combination of things that we need to fight. And the best way to fight that is, number one, working to strengthen institutions. Number two, transparency, basically calling out those engaged in bad behavior and emphasizing to Latin America, it's in your interest. It's not China bad or not. It is, if your leaders are doing this, it is your leaders undercutting the benefit for, your national, for you to realize the value added for yourself and your people. And so to do a more effective job in messaging, calling out that type of thing, even as we continue to strengthen institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis.
Just 2 points. Nearshoring is a great opportunity that's unique to this region geographically. We should win-win solutions, that one. And then a much broader point, which is relating to some of the points Evan just made. Let's, as the United States, as Americans, practice what we preach, vote next month, and really be very self-conscious about the important message we're going to send to the world on November 5th about our own democracy.
Beautiful. Well, thank you all. Thank you for participating in this wonderful panel. Thank you, Brookings Institute, FIU as well. And thank you all for being here and paying attention and formulating fantastic questions for our panelists. So, we hope you enjoyed it and you learned a lot, because there was a lot digested here today. No, thank you. No, I appreciate it. Really appreciate it. I have so many questions, but the thing is that you talked about all of what I had.
I have this thing.